What is the position of Torah Eretz Yisrael regarding waiting between meat and milk?
Over the last months, I have given a series of shiurim, approximately 15 in number, regarding this question. What is the halakha, the original halakha in the primary sources, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, regarding this question? How long does one have to wait after eating meat before one can consume dairy products? These shiurim were given in Hebrew, and I have been asked to summarize those shiurim and to explain in English the bottom line. Briefly then, here is an overview of the sugya, of the Talmudic discussion, and therefore the halakha that is derived from that discussion. When we studied the sugya in the Talmud Bavli, in Masechet Hulin, Daf Kof Daled Kof Hey, 104, 105, in the Talmud Bavli, and we examine the various interpretations and understandings of the earliest sources, that is to say the Geonim and the Rishonim, from early medieval times and even before that, we discover that there are essentially two positions, two very different understandings. According to one position, and this is the well-known and common practice today, and has been for many generations, according to one position, if one eats dairy products, one is not required to wait at all before eating meat products. However, the reverse is not true. Having eaten meat, one is required to wait several hours, according to many poskim, 6 hours, and according to some others, perhaps a little bit less than that, before one may consume dairy products. This is the view of the Rif, of the Rambam, and the Rashba, and many other Rishonim. However, here too, there are two schools of thought within this position, within this first understanding. According to the vast majority of the Rishonim who hold this position, that one must wait between meat and milk, this halakha applies only with regards to meat as opposed to poultry. That is to say, if one ate beef or lamb or the meat of a goat, one is required to wait several hours before one may eat dairy products. But if one ate poultry, that is to say chicken or turkey or duck, etc., then according to many of the Rishonim who hold this position with regards to beef, with regards to poultry, they understand that there is no such requirement, that one may, directly having finished eating, shall we say, a piece of chicken, one may go on to have ice cream for dessert or coffee with milk. This is the position of Rashi, this is the position of the Ramban and the Ritba, and in fact a majority of the Rishonim who hold the overall position of this first school of thought, that one must wait many hours after consuming meat, that is to say beef or lamb. The vast majority of those Rishonim understand that this does not apply to poultry. This is all based on explicit statements in the Sugya, in the Talmudic discussion. There is another school of thought within this position, another view, that there is no difference between poultry and other types of meat. The first of the Rishonim to express this view was Rambam, and in fact very few Rishonim accepted his position, namely the Rashba, the Meiri, and the Riaz. Other than these four Rishonim, none of the Rishonim understood the Sugya in this fashion. That is the first position, that is to say, the view that holds that after eating meat, one must wait many hours before consuming dairy products. As opposed to that school of thought, we find in other ancient sources that there is in fact no requirement at all to wait between eating meat and following this with dairy products. That one may eat one after the other without any waiting period, any specified or mandatory waiting period, on condition that one does certain things between one and the other, between the meat and the milk. That is to say, one must wash one's hands and clean out one's mouth, either by eating certain foodstuffs, such as a bite of bread or something else, which cleans out the mouth from any particles of meat that may be found within the mouth. And according to some views, one also should rinse out one's mouth with water. Today, of course, we are able to brush our teeth. We can use dental floss to remove any meat that might be caught between the teeth, which is also something mentioned in the Talmudic Sugya, in the discussion. And having done these things, one may immediately go on to eat dairy products without any waiting at all. This second opinion is generally unknown nowadays. Most Jews, most religious Jews, and in fact most rabbis, this may be surprising what I am saying now, but it is a fact, most rabbis are not familiar with this second school of thought. But when one delves into the subject thoroughly, one discovers not only that at least 50% of the Rishonim are of this view, such Rishonim as Rabbeinu Tam and the Ba'ala Ma'or and the Ra'ah and many others. Further, but more than that, we discover that the earliest sources that we have before us, from the first half of the Geonic period, we refer here to the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries, we discover that these earliest recorded opinions and commentaries that we have before us today are unanimous in agreeing with this second approach, that there is in fact no requirement, according to the Talmudic Sugya, to wait between meat and milk. This is the view of Rav Yehuda Gaon, one of the most important, most prominent, and one of the earliest Geonim whose works we have before us. Rav Yehuda Gaon was in fact the head of both the yeshiva, the academy in Surah, and also in Pumbedita Ditha, a most unusual circumstance. This is why Rabbeinu Tam refers to him as Rosh L'Shtei Yeshivot, the head of both academies. We find this in a teshuvah of Rav Yehuda Gaon. 1 century later, the mid-9th century, Leminyanam, in the classic and highly regarded work Halachot Gedolot of Rabbi Shimon Kaira, one of the most authoritative halachic works of all time, we find the same position, that there is in fact no requirement as such to wait between eating meat and milk. Rather, one must clean out one's mouth, as we described before, and wash one's hands, and then one is able to immediately go ahead, even in the same meal, one is able to go ahead and eat dairy products. This very same position is to be found again a couple of generations later in the Sidur of Rav Sa'aya Gaon, This we do not find in the version, or that which remains of the Sidur of Rav Saadia Gaon, Zichron Livracha, that we have before us, which is not complete, but it is quoted explicitly, word for word, in a work by a Hacham, a great scholar, who lived in Teiman, in Yemen, one generation after the Rif, after Rabbi Yitzhak al-Fasi, in which he mentions this Shita, this Psak Halacha of Rav Saadia Gaon, with which he does not agree. But the fact is that Rav Saadia Gaon was of this opinion. It is only the Geonim at the very end of the Gaonic period in Pumbeditha, that is to say Rav Hai Gaon, apparently also Rav Sharira Gaon, but we don't have any explicit source to that effect, who held the other position. That is to say, the first school of thought, that there is a requirement to wait between meat and milk. Almost certainly this did not apply to poultry, according to their view, but there is a requirement to wait between beef or lamb and dairy products, with or without reference to having cleaned one's mouth, or rinsed it out, or removed meat stuck between the teeth, and having washed one's hands. None of that is sufficient, one has to wait. These two opinions exist. There is no question, no doubt about that. What I demonstrated in these many shiurim on the subject was that not only is the second school of thought, which is in fact in chronological terms the first school of thought, the earlier opinion, which we find in all the earlier sources, as we mentioned, Rav Yudai Gaon, the Halachot Gedoloth, Rav Saadia Gaon, and later, as mentioned before, in many of the Rishonim. Not only is that position readily explained, and not only is it straightforward to explain the Sugya in terms of that understanding, in terms of that position, it is in fact easier to understand the Talmudic discussion in its entirety, which takes up approximately 1.5 dapim, about 3 sides of a page, of 3 pages of the Talmud. It is in fact easier to understand the Sugya in terms of that understanding, that approach, as opposed to the other school of thought, which is the more generally accepted school of thought nowadays. Having completed those shiurim, as I said, in Hebrew, I was recently contacted by a young scholar who lives in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, who pointed out to me that there are other non-halachic but rather Haggadic sources which indicate that this second school of thought, or in fact, as we said, chronologically speaking, the first or earlier school of thought, which does not require waiting, is in fact the more ancient position. And this also serves these sources that he mentioned to me, or this one source that he mentioned to me, as I will explain in a moment, serve also to fill in the gap with regards to the Talmud Yerushalmi, with reference to this halacha, because unfortunately we do not have any Talmud Yerushalmi on the Seder of Kodashim, and therefore on Masechet Holim, where this discussion appears, we have no such Talmudic discussion in the Jerusalem Talmud. So the question may be asked legitimately, what is the position, or what was the position of the Hachamim in Eretz Yisrael at that time? And as we know, there are always parallel sources outside of the Talmud Yerushalmi, but from the same period of time, roughly, which reflect the positions and statements that we often find in the Talmud Yerushalmi. And as soon as this individual contacted me and mentioned this midrash that I'm about to share with you, I immediately realized that it had simply slipped my mind. And I immediately went to my bookshelf and opened up the relevant Midrash Haggadah, and there it was. The Midrash was there, and I in fact had used a marker to emphasize the relevant statement many decades ago when I first delved into this topic in depth. So I will now share with you two sources, Midrashei Haggadah, non-halachic sources from the time of Hazal, which clearly reflect the facts on the ground at that time in Eretz Yisrael. The first of these sources is in Midrash Tehillim, Mizmor Heth, with regards to Perek, or chapter 8 of Tehillim, Psalms. The Midrash describes a discussion, even an argument between the angels and Hashem with regards to the giving of the Torah to Am Yisrael, to the Jewish people. The Malachim are represented as being of the opinion that human beings are not worthy of the Torah, and it should remain, as it were, in heaven. Human beings live in a material and mundane world, and the angels did not think that they were worthy of the Torah. And Hashem, on the other hand, in this Midrash, is presented as disagreeing with them vehemently. And the Midrash goes on to say as follows. This is in this version of Midrash Tehillim, which is the edition of Rabbi Shlomo Buber, on page 75, Lamed Heth. It says as follows. Hashem says to the angels, you think that you can keep the Torah, but that is not true. It is the Jews who keep the Torah. Because when I sent 3 of you, angels, in the guise of men, to Avraham Avinu, it says in the Torah, in Bereshith, Perek Yod Heth, Pasuk Heth, 18:8 in Genesis, Vaikah Hem'ah Wahalav, Avraham Avinu took butter or cream and milk, Uven HaBakar Asher Asa, and the young calf that he had prepared, meat in other words, Waiten Lifnehem, and he placed it before them. He thought they were human beings. He did not know at that point that they were angels, and he wished to honor them. He invited them into his home, into his tent. Buhu Omed Alehem, and he stood by to serve them as they ate. Tahad Ha'es, under the tree, Wayochelu, and they ate. So you, angels, when you were served meat and milk together, it says you ate. However, the Jewish people are not so. Not only do they keep that which is written in the Torah, they even added certain restrictions on themselves, took upon themselves certain additional halachot, which does not allow them to do that which you did. Goes on to say as follows, V'thinok shelahem, even a young child of them, of those Jews, of those people to whom you refer, you angels, the people that you claim are not worthy of the Torah. Thinok shelahem keshehu ba mibeth rabo, a young child comes home from school, Ve'imo noteneth lo path, and his mother gives him something to eat, path, bread, uvasar, ugvina le'echol, and meat and cheese to eat. And what does he say to his mother? V'hu omer la, Hayom limedani Rabbi, my teacher taught us today, he taught me today, lo tavashel gadi b'halev imo. One must not, as the Torah states explicitly, one must not cook the kid of the lamb, or the goat kid in its mother's milk. And from this pasuk, from this verse, many other halachot are derived, including the fact that we do not eat meat and milk together, even when they are not cooked together. From this midrash already we see that for a Jewish mother in the days that this midrash refers to, this goes back to Talmudic times roughly. In those days it would not have been unusual for a Jewish mother who was fully aware of the customs and practices of the Jewish people to give her son some bread and some meat and also some cheese. She certainly assumed that he would know, or he would immediately tell her that I cannot eat them together, but I can eat them one after the other, and therefore she would give them to him in the same meal. That is the clear implication from this source, although it does not explicitly state in which manner the child could go about eating these things one after the other. In order to hear even a more detailed description and indication of what the halacha was at that time in Eretz Yisrael, we have another midrash. I refer to this midrash, Pesikatha Rabbafi. This is the edition of Meir Ish Shalom. This is to be found on page Kof Kaf Heth 128. This is in the Pesikatha Siman Kaf He, number 25. Aser Ta'asir. Here we find a similar discussion between the angels and Hashem about the giving of the Torah to the Jewish people. Again, we hear the same kinds of arguments by the angels that the Torah is too sublime, too holy to be brought down to this world, and it should not be given to the Jewish people. And again, we find in this midrash, as we found in the early midrash we mentioned, Midrash Tehillim Siman Heth, that Hashem disagrees, and he points out to them something very similar to what we just read. And here the wording and the statement is more explicit and more, therefore, more illuminating. It says as follows: Omer lehem ha-Kodesh Baruch Hu. Hashem says to the angels, Atem hem shemekayimim et ha-Torah. Are you those? You keep the Torah. You live according to the Torah, and not rather than the Jews. Not true. Tinok hagomul b'Yisrael mikayma yoter mikem. A young child of the Jewish people keeps the Torah more than you. Yoseh mi bet hasefer. When a child leaves school and he goes home, or he has something to eat, im hayalo le'echol basar, if he has some meat to eat, halav, and also some dairy product. It says milk. So if he has both meat and milk to eat for his lunch, efshar lo le'echol halav, is he able to drink that milk ad shirhas yado min basar, without first washing his hands, having eaten the meat? From this we understand clearly that eating meat and then drinking milk or eating some dairy product immediately afterwards, albeit with the washing of one's hands in between. Not all the details and all the halachot here are mentioned. As we said, this is not an halachic work, this is an Haggadic work. So the various halachot to do with how one cleans out one's mouth, and if one has to remove meat stuck between the teeth, are not mentioned here. But the general description clearly indicates that eating meat followed by milk in the same meal was a reality. And the point of the Midrash is to say that even a young child who, having left school and now is eating some lunch, having finally got out of school and is hungry, and he has some meat and he has some milk, even a young child knows and lives up to this halacha that the Jewish people have kept for so long, namely that he does not eat the dairy product, he does not drink the milk or eat the cheese after having eaten some meat until he first washes his hands, and without doubt he would also do the other things required with regards to cleaning out one's mouth. Certainly, we would not expect any Jewish mother today, familiar with the Jewish law and custom, to give her child, as it said in the earlier Midrash we quoted, some bread, some meat, and some cheese together in the same meal. This would simply be unheard of. In the same way that in the Sugya, in the halachic discussion, we find the mahaloketh, the discussion, the argument between Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel, whether one is allowed to place on the table at the same time poultry, not beef, not lamb, but poultry, and cheese. One may not eat them together, but one may eat them one after the other. And therefore Beth Shammai is of the view that one may place the cheese and the poultry on the table at the same time. Beth Hillel disagree, and the halacha is like Beth Hillel, that one may not do so, because if they're on the table before a person when eating, he may forget and eat them together. But again, such a discussion would not be possible today. When has anybody seen in an Orthodox Jewish home any kind of meat, including poultry, placed on the table at the same time as cheese? This could simply not occur. And there would be no reason to do such a thing, because according to common practice today, they cannot be eaten at the same meal. So for what reason would you possibly want to place them on the table together? Such a discussion between Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel, therefore, could not possibly exist. Similarly, here we find in these two midrashim, the first which describes the mother giving the child a piece of bread, a piece of meat, and some cheese, and the boy knowing that he has to distinguish between the meat and the cheese by washing his hands in between, and cleaning out his mouth, etc. He knows that these things cannot be eaten together, but they may be eaten one after the other, and that's why the mother gives them to him at the same time, at the same meal. And here too, in this Midrash, in Psikatha Rabbathi, Siman Kaf He, where it states explicitly that even a young child, coming home from school knows that he must wash his hands after eating some meat before he eats a dairy product or drinks some milk. So the Jewish people know about this and live up to this standard. But you, the angels, Hashem says to them, Wa'atem, Keshe nishlachtem esel Avraham. You were sent to Avraham Avinu. Hevi lifnechem basar, he placed before you meat, wahalav, and milk, as we just read from the Pasuk in Bereshith, ka'ahath, together, at the same time, wa'achaltem, and you ate. The implication is that you ate them together. So, you are not in a position to claim that you are more worthy of the Torah, that you live up to the Torah more than the Jewish people. These are the statements that we find in these two midrashim. Both of these midrashim clearly come from Eretz Yisrael, although both of these midrashim were probably redacted in their present form at some time in the 7th, 8th or 9th centuries, but the material is by and large of much earlier provenance, and therefore reflects the views and the practices of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael in the time of the Mishnah, the time of the Talmud, and even up to the period of the Geonim, even towards the latter days of the Geonim. These sources provide further indirect proof, what we describe in Torah discussions as Messiah lefi tumo. This is like a person who's speaking about one subject without realizing that we may be able to discover something or discern something from what he is saying about a different and unrelated subject. So a person says something Messiah lefi tumo, or he's just speaking innocently without any intention or without meaning to reveal something. These statements and these midrashim are not coming to teach us any halachot. They are just mentioning, as it were by the way, in passing, something which was well known to all people at that time that this is what the Jews do, that if they wish to eat one type of food, meat, in this meal, and in the same meal to eat some dairy product, they can do so, but there are certain restrictions and certain halachot, certain things that must be done, but they can be eaten at the same meal. Otherwise, these two midrashim could not make such statements. This provides very convincing, cogent proof that this was the Shita in Eretz Yisrael in the time of the Mishnah, the time of the Talmud, and even in the generations following the redaction of the Talmud. This is a good example of how various sources from different parts of the Torah can and should be taken into account when wishing to understand the halachic discussions and positions of the halachic decisors, the Rishonim, the Geonim, in earlier times. These Midrashim, therefore, furnish conclusive proof that the school of thought of Rav Yehuda Gaon, the Halachot Gedolot, Rav Saadia Gaon, and many Rishonim who followed in their footsteps, such as Rabbeinu Tam and the Baal HaMaor, the Ra'ah, this Shita, this approach, this halachic position was the original position that was followed apparently throughout the Jewish world in ancient times. And many Rishonim, even in more recent times, that is to say in the medieval period, in the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries in Europe, were of this position, held this view, and were of this opinion, halacha l'ma'aseh.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.